Hello and welcome to What Just Happened. I'm Marco Giannangeli, and today we'll be looking at Chinese leaders Xi Jinping's recent visit to North Korea, what it means in terms of a shifting balance with Russia. To do this, I'm joined by Principal Asian Analyst Jonah Kaplan and Lead European Analyst Alexander Lord. Welcome, guys. Jonah, let's begin with you. How significant was this recent visit to North Korea by Xi?
Thanks, Marco. Well, firstly, any visit by Xi Jinping is significant. He was once a world traveller in his first and second terms, but he increasingly rarely goes abroad. Last year, he went on a trip to Central Asia, he went on a trip to Southeast Asia, and he went to South Korea, where he met President Trump. This year, this is his first state visit anywhere. In fact, there has actually been a queue of foreign leaders, including from America, from Russia, from Europe, coming to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping to sign agreements and to expand relations. So the fact he has chosen North Korea is significant. It's the first time he has gone in 7 years. And frankly, the geopolitical environment we are in today is far removed from what it was 7 years ago. At that time, there was, in the middle of the 3 separate negotiations and meetings between Trump and Kim, when Xi was trying to exert influence. Now, what North Korea's position is much stronger, both economically, in which it has benefited from theft of cryptocurrency globally, while also geopolitically gaining prominence, predominantly due to its growing ties with Russia in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Russia. What do you think was on Xi's mental tick list as he sort of flew to Pyongyang?
Well, fundamentally, North Korea is a much more important country, and it is a strategic player in the region, and North Korea is the only country that China has a mutual defense treaty with, and actually that was the reason why he visited, ostensibly to celebrate the 65th anniversary of that treaty being signed. But there are more factors at play. While China is still North Korea's main trading partner, accounting for over 98% of its trade and its main benefactor and supporter, it is also wary of growing ties between Russia and North Korea. Now, there's also the optics in the September 3rd military parade in Beijing, in which Putin, Kim, and Xi stood together, which many analysts described as a sort of birth of a new world order. There's an element of common interest between the 3 countries, but also there is a level of competition and tug of war, and China is somewhat concerned about whether North Korea would align too overtly with Russia. While it's not to say that it's the same as North Korea working with the US or an overt ally with overt enemy with Beijing, while Russia is an ally, China wants to make sure that it is still the big dog in the relationship and the key partner of North Korea.
Thanks, Jonah. Alexander, hello. Just as Jonah said, much has changed with North Korea since 2019. Much has changed with Russia too, hasn't it?
Absolutely. The relationship between Russia and North Korea has been on a journey in that time, to the extent that, obviously, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, Russia, up until around about 2017, I believe, was broadly speaking voting in favor of sanctions regimes against North Korea. It had allied itself with the general global consensus, which was nuclear proliferation in North Korea is not in anybody's interests. That's where we were. Where we are now is very, very different. And actually, the relationship between Pyongyang and Moscow is as tight as ever. And it's actually quite interesting, Jonah, that you mentioned that North Korea is the only country that China has signed a mutual defense treaty with. But it is now no longer the case that China is the only country that North Korea has signed a mutual defense agreement with. It has one with Russia. And I think that does underscore just how deep this relationship has become, particularly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was launched in 2022.
Alex, can you tell us a little bit about how the relationship has blossomed? What is Russia offering North Korea? What is North Korea in return offering Russia?
So both have a lot to offer one another in many ways. So obviously, the most immediate support that the Russians can provide the ailing North Korean economy, are commodities, staple goods, oil, petroleum, diesel, etc., even food, grain, etc., those sorts of things. There is, of course, the issue around military technology, which perhaps we could talk into a little bit more in more detail. The Russians have a lot of military technology, which it could well provide the North Koreans, should it wish. So it's pretty clear what the North Koreans can get out of Russia. But likewise, there's a lot that the Russians can get out of the North Koreans, and they've utilized that in their war against Ukraine. So what the North Koreans have in multitude are men and artillery shells, and indeed, to an extent, a lesser extent, missiles, ballistic missiles, and components. So beginning in 2023, really, we started to see an increasing North Korean involvement in the war. Not only, there are many partners. Russia has many partners, which has facilitated to varying extents its war with Ukraine. No country has been so open and clear and deep in its not only support but involvement as North Korea. The Chinese, for example, it's pretty clear they facilitate the war to a significant extent. The export of dual-purpose systems is well documented, and increasing number of reports indicate military-grade equipment is just being sent there as well. So, the level of support, not only in terms of economic facilitation, but direct military, indirect military support is pretty clear. The North Koreans have sent tens of thousands of men to fight, admittedly inside Russia, not inside Ukraine. So when the Ukrainians invaded the Kursk Oblast inside Russia, they obviously took a decent chunk of land, and it was at that point that we began to see the relationship take on a new and more direct phase. The North Koreans deploying various troops to help liberate that territory. That was successfully completed last year, and the North Koreans, in our understanding, played a significant, not a pivotal. I think sometimes the North Korean component and contingent has been slightly overplayed. They were an important source of manpower, but this is where I think the more nuanced approach to the relationship is important to understand what North Korea is getting out of helping Russia in this war. Well, North Korea, unlike South Korea, now has direct experience of a modern drone-dominated war. And it's pretty clear from what we can see from the battlefield and various reports from within Russia that the North Koreans have learnt some very sharp lessons in terms of infantry tactics, as well as drone operations. As we know, often the best way to learn is to make a mistake. And that's one of the key things that the North Koreans are getting out of this. They are going to be able to apply the lessons that not only the Russians have learned, but also themselves directly, and apply that to their doctrine in preparation for any potential escalation on the Korean peninsula.
Jonah, there is a bit of an argument that states that North Korea has been a bit of a burden to China. It's a pariah state. Russia's also a pariah state. Let Russia take some of the heat by dealing with North Korea as well. But I know you believe there's a counter argument to this as well. And I'm minded of the Chinese idiom, same bed, different dreams. It's a very pragmatic relationship, isn't it? What do you think China is making of this relationship between North Korea and Russia?
Well, Xi Jinping definitely believes in that counter-argument. It's worth stating that China-North Korea ties have not always been cordial. There have been tensions in the 90s when China was opening up its economy and North Korea was further closing its, and North Korea accusing China of not providing enough support during North Korea's famine. Even China, as Alex outlined, Russia's support for various United Nations Security Council resolutions against North Korea over its nuclear testing. China was involved in that, and China worked with the US. North Korea went as far as to call China an enemy. So that, to me, very much symbolizes that China is not overly happy about North Korea as a nuclear power. It doesn't support massive expansion of nuclear weapons and spread across the world, at least in its official policies. But I think there's probably the pragmatism right now which says there's no way that North Korea is getting rid of their nuclear weapons. It's kind of a done deal. A lot of countries are coming to that same conclusion, frankly. But what China's looking at is probably the bigger picture here. So Kim announces that a few days before the summit, that he wants an exponential increase in North Korea's nuclear arsenal. There are reasons why China might not support this, because if that just brings more heat from the Americans and more cooperation between America, South Korea, and Japan, that's not in China's interest for its other regional security objectives. But given that North Korea is a nuclear power, China has to deal with what is, not what it wants it to be. And it's very notable that following the Xi-Kim summit, there was no reference to denuclearization. During Trump's meeting with Xi last month, the US statement said that both Trump and Xi were committed to denuclearization of the peninsula, but no such comments appeared in Chinese diplomatic language.
And I think, Alex, the same might be said for Russia as well. There is an avenue, isn't there, that Putin might well get some brownie points with President Trump were he to influence Kim to freeze his nuclear program. But Jonah, that's not going to happen, is it?
Sure, I think what you were saying is more of the language that is grounded in some sort of realistic arrangement, at least in terms of if there were to be talks. That's the sort of bottom line that North Korea would even consider talking about. Denuclearization, while there was rhetorically commitments to that, there was never actual action towards that. Now we've even lost the rhetoric. So we could talk about a potential freezing, and there's signs of the Trump administration being perhaps more willing to have entered such an arrangement than in previous administrations, but it's also distracted with other conflicts around the world. But I would be interested in Alex's take, because I also think that in the 2010s, what we had is the main Security Council members working together on several issues, notably the JCPOA with Iran, as well as on sanctions with Russia, with sanctions on Iran. It does seem like the international climate is a bit different now.
Absolutely. So, like I said, the Russian approach to this has shifted. Broadly speaking, the Russians, obviously, as a permanent Security Council member, as the owner of the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, the Russians have guarded their nuclear status very, very jealously, and have, broadly speaking, been in very much in favor of anti-proliferation legislation and consensus around the world. It is traditionally not been in Russia's interests to allow even soft allied states to acquire nuclear weapons. It's, broadly speaking, been pretty clear on that. The situation is an interesting one to compare and contrast with Russia's now de jure acceptance, essentially, of North Korea's nuclear program, with the lackluster Russian approach to Iran's own nuclear program, which many in Tehran consider not to be sufficient level of support. that I think does underscore the level, the limits to which the Russians are, generally speaking, willing to support nuclear proliferation. Obviously, the North Koreans have the advantage that they developed the nuclear weapons. That Rubicon has been crossed, and there is a pragmatic approach to this, as you mentioned, Jonah, that is now starting to percolate across multiple world leaders. The Russians are an important part of that, given their permanent status within the Security Council, given that they have now begun over the last few years to veto Security Council resolutions against North Korea. Essentially now, the North Koreans, there's going to be very little that the UN can do against this nuclear program. It has to, broadly speaking, now be bilateral or minilateral rather than at UN level, because they now have that benefactor on the Security Council. As you mentioned, the relationship with China doesn't quite give North Korea that level of security at the moment. Now, of course, these relationships could change, they could shift, and indeed, I expect they will in the coming decades. But at the moment, both sides in Moscow and in Pyongyang, there is a lot of mutual understanding, there's a lot of mutual benefit, and particularly given Russia's primary geostrategic goals, which is essentially to dismantle the post-Cold War world order, the North Koreans could play an important role in that. And regarding the earlier points about the relationships that Putin could well leverage regarding President Donald Trump, if indeed President Donald Trump considers North Korea to be a priority, in the coming years before the end of his current term, if there is interest and dynamism within the administration akin to what we saw in Trump's first term, Putin is in a position potentially to facilitate meetings, to bring Kim and Trump together in a way that arguably Xi is not. And I think that is something that Putin could well attempt to leverage to his advantage. Again, Putin is not doing anything out of the kindness of his heart. It has to advance his own objectives and ambitions. And I think advancing a relationship between Pyongyang and Washington, should that be attractive to the White House, that could well benefit Russia in facilitating, again, better, more pragmatic and direct relations with Washington themselves. So North Korea sits in quite a complex web of geopolitical interactions, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see how all this plays out.
And while we observe this sort of tug of war, as Jonah put it, between China, Russia over North Korea, there are potential tensions between Beijing and Moscow in the offing, aren't there? I'm thinking of particularly Siberia, Alex.
Absolutely. So the aphorism "same bed, different dreams." It's a great metaphor for the Sino-Russian relationship, really, because the current geopolitical situation means that Russia and China are in alignment in many ways, but they have fundamental, historic, and deep disagreements in many ways. At the moment, considering the pragmatic advantages of essentially opposing the US-based order, etc., and trying to build out a multipolar world, as the Russians want to put it, a lot of those disagreements are ignored. They are parked for now, but they are definitely an elephant in the room. And you can get you get that sense, particularly when you start to read nationalistic analysis, both in Moscow and in Beijing. And I think that is where you start to see some of the cracks, that the facade that the leaders want to present of a relationship with no limits. A no limit relationship does have limits. And I think I'm not a China specialist by any stretch, but my understanding is that of all the things that the Chinese struggle with Russia is the fact that the only unequal treaty, the 19th century unequal treaties that is still in play, is the treaty with Russia, and it's the Russian acquisition of what is now Khabarovsk Oblast, and all the regions east of the Amur River. That's the only one that's still legal and still active. That causes some element of resentment, particularly amongst the nationalist components within China. This again is a very awkward situation, and in terms of where we're understanding the trajectory of Sino-Russian relations, I think this can't be ignored. The fact is that the Chinese are buying up eye-wateringly large swaths of land in Siberia. A lot of those areas are the territories which the Qing Empire previously ruled, and some, you could argue, that some nationalist commentators certainly believe to be sovereign Chinese territory. So the long-term trajectory here is one of imbalance. Absolutely, the Chinese economic preponderance is dwarfing the Russian, but the Russians have the land, and I think the fact that they are starting to buy up this land, I think, does tell us something about what the Chinese are sort of wanting in the future. And I think they want some sort of resolution, whether not necessarily from conquest, but certainly some sort of rearrangement of that treaty. But I'd be interested to hear Jonah's perspective.
Well, yeah, I think you put it very well. And if I was just to bring the Siberia situation up to the present day, there's another issue that concerns Siberia, and that's the Power of Siberia pipeline that's been long negotiated, still hasn't come through. In one of Xi and Putin's recent meetings, they committed to finally building it, but there's still no agreement on price. There's still no agreement on quantity that's going through the pipelines. From China's point of view, it has benefited hugely from the war in Ukraine in terms of buying cheap oil from Russia. It would love to keep those taps going, but at discount. And, Russia's wartime discount, China wants to keep that going for as long as possible, and I'm not sure Russia will. So there's definitely areas of disagreement, not just historic, not just current, but in the future that is yet to transpire.
Thank you, Jonah. In the meantime, very quickly, we are left with a North Korea that presumably you would agree is in its strongest position for a long time.
North Korea has more leverage than it ever has had in its history. It's strongest economically. The regime is strongest domestically, and that's the most legitimacy. It has nuclear weapons. It is a lesson to all countries in the world, a stark lesson, which is that a country with nuclear weapons is not one to be messed around with, and one that carries a geopolitical position, has strength, and cannot be bullied. So yes, it is in its limelight in terms of geopolitical influence.
Thank you very much, Jonah. Thank you, Alexander, as well. And thank you all for joining us for this week's What Just Happened. I look forward to seeing you all again next week.